critics want to link him to Dylan and Harrison. They were two of his closest friends. But to me, he was always more like Hank Williams or Woody Guthrie, who were writing songs for the people.
Yeah.
And they wrote great songs. They were crafty songwriters. They wrote great melodies. You know, they had songcraft down. But they weren't trying to write hits. They were trying to write songs that meant something to people. And Woody Guthrie said, the worst thing that can happen is to cut yourself loose from the people. And the best thing is to sort of vaccinate yourself right into the big streams and blood of the people. That's what Tom did. You know, Tom was always caring about the people and wanting to write songs that people would like. You know, he was writing songs that expressed him. It was his art, it was his expression, but it was to reach other people. It wasn't to impress people, it was to reach people and to express himself. And he was such an expressive person. I mean, you knew that if you go to a show and there's 50,000 of you out there, or us out there, bigger than many small towns, and he's touching everyone in their heart, and they're singing along, and they're all united by one song. And it's such a delicate thing, it's words and music, but it came from his heart and his spirit. There's a friend calling me right now. I just thought they were going, enough, I'll wrap it up. I'm always worried about that. Who is it, Tom? Tom worried about that stuff too. He worried about stuff, even if it didn't matter. But he had a lot of folk wisdom about songwriting, like I was saying earlier. He knew which, he would talk to people, and he knew which wisdom to accept and which ones not to accept, which bits of wisdom not to accept. For example, Roy Orbison said something to him which other people have said to me. Mose Allison said too about songwriting, that if you got an idea that's good enough, don't worry about recording it. If it's good enough, you'll remember it. Not true. Especially when, I mean, it might be certainly for Roy Orbison or Mose Allison, who were geniuses, but generally when you're writing a lot of songs, like Tom was, writing melodies, sometimes you get a melody, who knows where that came from? It could be the same chords, it could be one chord, you're playing a C major chord, and suddenly you got a whole other melody. As Tom said, sometimes you pick up the guitar and he said, sometimes it just feels friendly. Other days, no. And if you don't capture those melodies immediately, at least my mind will start to normalize the thing, like everything else I've done, and you're trying to make it a little different. So he felt too that's very important to tape, especially music. But then there were other bits of wisdom that he learned, and he said, this is a good thing for songwriters to understand, because he said so many times a guy will come up to me and say, Tom, you have got to hear my new song. I have just made this chord progression that you have never heard before. There's a chord in there that I don't think anyone's ever used before, the chord progression. Wait till you hear this. And Tom would listen, often patiently, maybe not always, and go, you know what? You know why you've never heard that chord before in the song? That doesn't sound good at all. Take that chord out. In other words, you're not writing songs like a lot of us started or still did to impress other guitarists or other songwriters. Like, wow, a triple diminished right in G major and then it goes to the F minor. Never would have thought of that. If it doesn't propel the melody and if it doesn't sound good and seamless, Tom would take that out, And yet he would find those unusual progressions that just sounded great and soulful and visceral. But that almost seems like an obvious thing. And he said that happened a lot. And he thought a lot of people, he said, for example, he thought Hendrix, this is one of the greatest guitarists of all time, was also a tremendous songwriter, a real inventive, amazing musician, a melodist, but also a remarkable songwriter. But that's very unusual to have a songwriter who's that great on the instrument. Generally, they're great songwriters like Tom, and they got a Mike Campbell, or Springsteen has, Steven, or Nils Lofgren, or both of them at the same time now. And Clarence, too, Clarence's nephew. But, so he said for that reason, some guitarists that came up really became, great guitarists and spent all their time learning, how to play lead guitar. Didn't spend a lot of time on the artistry of songwriting. So he said, I thought their songwriting suffered because it was all about guitar. And it was a good showcase for guitar, but are those great songs? And so he understood that it wasn't about the guitar part, it wasn't about the chords, it was about the whole thing, the totality of it, which is kind of an obvious lesson. But Tom, he understood those things. And I think that's one reason he had such longevity, that he understood those basic things. And he never let go of that. It was interesting when we started the book. The idea, as I said, was to be just conversations about music. That was the idea, but it became very quickly apparent that all his music was about his life, and all his life was about his music. So it really was impossible for him to start to discuss music without discussing his life. And he embraced it. So we kind of said, well, we can talk about both. And there were a few, stories that I'd heard about it, and I wanted just to know if they were true. I did my research, and one of the most notorious ones was that the reason the Pettys were in Florida, here in this town, Gainesville, was because his grandfather, Heartwood Petty, killed a guy in Georgia and had to get here, so he wasn't killed there. And so I asked him, I just assumed that was one of those stories that you might find on Wikipedia, but no truth to that. And Tom said, actually, that is the story my dad told me. Didn't tell me until later in life that was true. He said, my grandmother was a full-blooded Cherokee Indian. My grandfather was a white guy. She was a cook in a logging camp, and he worked there. And they made timber into pulpwood. And he married my grandmother, which was not popular to mix the races, to put it lightly. And so they were in some danger, so fearing they might get hurt, his grandfather stole a horse and wagon. It's like a story out of the Great West. It literally is. Or the Great South, I should say. Stole a horse and wagon in the middle of the night, suddenly stopped on the road by several guys. As Tom put it, some kind of violent situation came down about him being with an Indian. Someone got insulted, and my grandfather ended up killing a guy. And, if not for that, the history of rock and roll would have been entirely different. That was a fortunate murder for rock and roll. We got Tom here to Florida. Also, I heard stories about his father, and, a lot of the great songwriters, John Lennon, McCartney, Springsteen, James Taylor had a real hard time with their fathers. Paul Simon just wanted a little approval. Like, what I did, it's not bad, how dad, and they needed that. Again, I think it drove a lot of them to prove something. I'm going to show him. And Tom's dad was a tough guy. Tom said he was kind of wild. He said he was always driving into ditches. He said, I thought everyone's father drove into ditches all the time, but I didn't know that was unusual. And Tom was a tender, emotional guy who loved music more than anything. He was romantic. He had a genius for memorizing things. He could memorize nursery rhymes when he was 4 or 5 immediately. And so when he discovered Elvis and got all those 45s and all the great records that he heard on radio, he could learn them immediately. He absorbed them like a sponge. But he was a very emotional kid, and his dad liked to go out hunting and shooting things and would insist that Tom go along. And Tom said it was kind of mandatory, but I never liked it. Tom hated hunting, shooting, hated being on the fishing boat with his dad too long. He said my dad was a hard man, hard to be around. He was hard on me. He wanted me to be a lot more macho than I actually was. I was this tender kid, more inclined to the arts than, shooting something. And this is a story, no one I knew in my whole life has ever told me a story that even resembles this one. It seems like a story, but it was Tom Petty telling me this story, and I know it's true. He said once he was out fishing with his dad, and again, I grew up in Chicago, this never happened, but to him, being here in Florida, you guys might know, an alligator came up. Mm-hmm. I've never had gator experience, especially during my childhood. It would have terrified me. So the alligator comes up, and his dad, not scared at all, this is how Tom said, I actually saw my dad take his forefinger and thumb and punch the eyes in on the alligator. Just show me that he could knock the alligator out. And then Tom, as if to affirm it, he said it over again. He was nuts. He said he took his thumb and forefinger and pushed the alligator's eyes in. He repeated it twice. And he goes, my daddy wasn't afraid of anything. Another time I once saw him grab a rattlesnake by the tail, swing it around his head, and pop his neck. That's pretty wild shit, Yeah. My dad was excellent at ping pong, but no rattlesnake has ever. But his dad also, and he said that a lot, and his dad was tough, but his dad had pride in him. And his dad bought him his first guitar, a Stella acoustic, and Tom got 2 lessons, and with only 2 lessons, he was on his way. And like a lot of great songwriters, as soon as he had a few chords, he started writing songs. It didn't take long. He didn't have to learn to be Hendrix first. His first song ever written when he was 12 was called Baby, I'm Leaving. It had 4 chords, he told me. It had a C and F, and he said F, as we all know, was the hardest chord to learn, but you gotta learn it, and he did. A G, 3 major chords, and an A minor. And he was crafty from the start. He was proud that there was an A minor in there. Right away, that'll be cool. And we know the story. He got to go see Elvis when Elvis was in Ocala. And the truth is, he didn't know much about Elvis. He told me he was just laying in the straw one day, and his aunt said, "You want to go see Elvis?" And he said, "I just knew he was this guy that wiggled. He wasn't an Elvis fan yet." And he went there, and Elvis comes out. He's like wondering if I'll recognize him. And suddenly this guy comes out glowing, you know, like Jesus, and that radiance. He said it was radiant, and all the girls, probably the guys there, but all the girls just went crazy, just went nuts. And that appealed to Tom. And Tom said, "I want that job." But in truth, he never thought of himself being a solo artist like Elvis, because it was another galvanizing experience. 1964, the Beatles. You heard about this band, the Beatles? Came to America, went on the Ed Sullivan Show. And that was a big deal because all of America wanted to see it. It was a phenomenon. It changed so many people's lives. In fact, one of the last interviews I did with Tom years after the book was out was for the 50th anniversary of when the Beatles were on Ed Sullivan. And he did a little interview with me for Grammy.com, which I didn't think he would do, but he said, "Yeah, I'll do it because it's you." Because he was a nice guy like that. He was always really loyal to friends and people he liked, and he was generous. And he talked about the Beatles. They made such an impact that was seeing that he could do that thing like Elvis, but with friends, but with really cool friends who looked like they were on top of the world and singing harmony and playing rock and roll. It really appealed to him. They were playing rock and roll, but that harmony, that camaraderie and the friendship, and these four guys doing it as a unit and doing it all, that really spoke to him. So from the beginning, that was his vision, not to be Elvis, but to be the Beatles. And but as you might notice, he wasn't the Heartbreakers, because he learned early on that you got to keep the Tom Petty name out there. He was a pure guy, and he had a good heart, but he also understood this is a business, it's an industry. And to be an artist in an industry is not easy, so he made it Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers. Just in case it fell apart, people would remember that name. And they did, that worked out. But before that, as you might know, his first band was the Sundowners, which he formed in school when a pretty girl named Cindy Crawford came up to him. Not the model Cindy Crawford, but a girl here in Gainesville. And friends here have confirmed that was her name. She said, "You have a band? Can you play at our thing?" And he lied and said yes. And then he got his friends together, and they had 3 guitars, sax and drums, all plugged into one Silvertone amp. They learned 4 instrumentals, and he said the first time they played together was the biggest rush of my life. He never stopped. They went to the party, they played their 4 songs. It was so great, and they loved it. They asked him if they could play more, and they played those same 4 songs again. Later, he learned more songs. He learned you don't have to repeat anything. But from then on, there was nothing that was going to stop him. That's all he wanted. And he knew he had to leave his hometown. And, leaving Gainesville was important to him, but obviously who he was that Gainesville kid. And so many times stuff he said reflected that Gainesville kid. So many times he said, "Gee, I wouldn't have thought when I was a kid in Gainesville that I'd be doing that." And a lot of famous people had to leave their hometowns to really make it. The Beatles left Liverpool. Jesus, as you might know, had to leave his hometown. It's not uncommon. But, Tom understood that. So he went to Hollywood, where I've lived for a long time. My son was born in Hollywood, but turned out pretty well anyway. But a lot of people come to Hollywood, like I did, and thinking, boy, it's just going to be shimmer and stardust and stars everywhere in limos. And then you see this industry town and go, this is Hollywood. A lot of people are dismayed, and a lot worse than dismayed. And wow, there's a lot of it is not great. It's the underbelly as well as the shimmer. Tom didn't feel that way, even though they put him up, as we said, a hooker's motel, the Hollywood premier, east of Western in Hollywood. You never want to go east of Western anywhere in Los Angeles if you don't have to. But he loved it. I said, "Were you dismayed by Hollywood?" He goes, "No, not at all. I loved it. Really." Because all I saw were record companies everywhere. There's Capitol, there's the Stones label, everywhere he saw, Warner Brothers, and that's what he was there for. And they, first with Mudcrutch, and then what became the Heartbreakers, they'd already recorded some good songs and had demos. So Tom came to Hollywood with just pure determination. Nothing is going to stop me. I'm going to get this job because this is the best job I can do, and I know how to do it. I'm going to get this job and make records. And he just came in a way I haven't heard hardly any other people. Maybe the Beatles just came with such determination and such completion already, realization already of the dream before it was realized that no one could stop him. But he did things no one else could do, because normally when you come to Hollywood, you're supposed to play the game and get your tape to someone with an attorney and go through the channels. Tom didn't do that. He goes right to Ben Frank's diner on Sunset Boulevard, and to a phone book, and I started looking up record companies, and he actually found a list of all the record companies and started calling them. You don't do this normally. He said, "Hi, I'm Tom Petty, I'm in town. I got a tape, can I bring it over?" And many people said, "Yeah, bring it over." And it worked. Right away there were offers, but that's unusual. People don't generally do that. But I think he saw exactly his pathway, and he was on it. It was getting out of here, getting all the way there. And the other thing was to keep the level of the songwriting up. To him, it was always about being real. That's what brought him to the thing. If he didn't feel the song, he wasn't going to put it out there. He never wrote a song because this will fit 1979 and will be a hit, and then be one of those guys who has to play a hit he hates for the rest of his life. He wrote songs that moved him. And as you could tell, the earliest songs, when he played American Girl, it meant just as much as American Dream Part B, from his last album, which was, a remarkable song. He was always fully invested in those songs, and that's what it was always about. But at the same time, he understood it wasn't easy. He wrote Rhino Skin. You know Rhino Skin? Mm-hmm. You need rhino skin if you're going to begin to walk through this world. You need elephant balls if you don't want to crawl on your hands through this world. That is Tom. And that was the essence of who he was. And he brought that to the band and to Rick Rubin. And he said everyone, one by one, spoke to him like, "I love the Rhino Skin song, love it. But the elephant balls? Maybe take the balls out of the elephant balls. Take that out." He said first Rick, and then one by one, everyone in the band said, yeah, I agree. Take the elephant balls out. So Tom, being Tom, recognized that that's good, but he said, still, everyone's saying it. I tried to find something that would work as well, but nothing else did. So he kept it in, but he felt kind of, battered by that. And it just shows, like, at that level. John Lennon at a certain level, he wasn't listening to anyone, except maybe Yoko, but he was, and I love Yoko, nothing wrong with that, she was a good wife. But he was, John Lennon left, Tom was always grounded. He was listening to everyone because he worked with people he respected always. And even though he liked to smoke marijuana, as you guys might know, he wasn't someone that smoked pot all the day. He would say, "I would never smoke it for a session, recording, never for a mix." He was very careful. He said maybe after the mix when you could relax. He was very serious. He was a real professional. Even when we worked on this book, which was really nice for me, because I've worked with other people since then on books, and it really showed me how great Tom was to work with in every way. Number one, he was polite and kind, but he also knew, don't make it harder than it needs to be. We would never do more than 2 hours in one day. So you never go in thinking, oh God, this is going to be endless. It's just going to be fun. And we'd never start before noon, primarily because he was never awake much before noon. And I love that too. He kept rock and roll hours, always. And I'd come over, and he had 2 houses in Malibu. He had the big giant house, which he said was like the Golden Gate Bridge. The work never stops. Someone's always working. It was enormous. I never saw much of it because we go in his recording studio, which is really comfy. And he always had a conga drum for his table, and we had a little refrigerator with Cokes in them, with those little tiny Cokes in the glass bottles. And we'd always drink those, and he'd always have a funny outfit on. I remember sometimes he had this really old suit, maybe from the 30s, white plaid, and he would just be smiling, like, can you believe someone would wear this? The big funny shoes and his weird hats or granny glasses, all sorts of stuff. It was always fun. Never the same thing twice. And he always had this kind of sleepy look in his eyes. Sometimes he was drinking coffee before we drank Coca-Cola because he just got up. But he was in a good mood. He wanted to talk about it. And he felt really happy. And I was living my life, and my son was just born, and I didn't live in Malibu at the time, though I lived in North Hollywood, which is quite a drive from there. So I never wanted to be late for Tom Petty, obviously. So I would give myself so much time that I was always way early. And so I would sit outside of the gates usually. I think cell phones were really new then. This was like 2005. I would just call friends and go, yeah, I'm here outside the gates. And I'd wait till it was time to go in. But he always had that look of like, yeah, let's go again. And we'd never have much small talk. Like, so what's going on? We just get to it. Like, what do you want to start with today? And he liked that the idea besides talking about his life is to talk about the songs. Every song that he recorded up to then, even ones that came out on and the anthology and cuts that weren't on the official albums. So I would come in knowing the songs. And I love that he wrote a little intro for it, which was one of the greatest things I've ever read. It was just so beautiful to read it. And because he mentioned me. And I know I was there with him the whole time, but you know, it was just really great, right there in our book. He said that he liked doing the book with me was because I had passion for songwriters and the way they wrote songs. And also, he said, Paul would come in ridiculously prepared, even to the extent of knowing how to play the songs himself. Which was true. But not to butter up the guy alone, but because it was so cool to learn his songs. I mean, anyone who loves music and plays it would want to do that. But he loved that. So I would come in knowing the songs really well, but sometimes he hadn't thought about one of those songs for a long time. So after